All right, El Gibor, just quickly before I summarize, El Gibor is used for human kings in Ezekiel 32:21, Ezekiel 32, verse 21. My opponent also writes that the title El in Isaiah 9:6, so you have El Gibor, mighty, the God, the singular of Elohim, El, and mighty. El is used also for human judges in Psalm 82. Rulers of the nations in Ezekiel 31:11. But my opponent writes that it's never used in any sense other than that of absolute deity. It's actually also used for the leaders of the land in 2 Kings 24. And of course, it's El appears in many names like Israel, Elijah, Joel, and even Daniel. So just to clear that up. Also, I want to go back to Deuteronomy 29, just to make this point clear to the audience. In Deuteronomy 29, if the litmus test is that you are also Yahweh, because you're speaking in the first person as Yahweh, well, then Moses has to be part of this Trinity. He clearly says, I have led you 40 years in the wilderness. That's Moses speaking. Moses clearly says, verse 6, I am the Lord your God. Verse 10, before the Lord your God, they're standing before Moses, and Moses is the speaker. There's no one else. There's no angel. There's no theophany. It's Moses himself. So are we to conclude that Moses is Yahweh as well? Now, not with you alone am I making this covenant, says Moses. This is seen by many Trinitarian scholars. The speaker's personality in Deuteronomy 29 is merged in that of the deity. That's in reference to Moses. Pulpit commentary, Moses introduces Jehovah himself as speaking to the people. And then you have Joshua 22, you obeyed all the instructions of Moses, he says, Joshua 22:2. And then the land that Moses gave you, and then carefully follow the commandments and teachings Moses gave you. But wait a minute, I thought it was Yahweh, the one God of Israel, who did that. So are we to conclude that Moses is part of this clued-at Trinity? Others as Yahweh in the Old Testament, Ezekiel 20. The word of Yahweh came to Ezekiel, and then he says, I swore to bring them out of Egypt. That's Ezekiel speaking. That's not an angel or anyone else. I gave them the Torah in verse 11. Joshua in chapter 24, Joshua assembled all the tribes and they presented themselves before God. It's Joshua speaking. In 1 Samuel 10, Samuel assembled Israel, and then in verse 22, Israel asked Yahweh. They're asking a man, not Yahweh himself. So if this is the litmus test, that whenever a prophet speaks in the first person, and I could show you many more, that means you're somehow part of a plurality of a God. I don't even know how to describe it. So to sum up, the scriptures clearly teach that the God of the Old Testament, in fact, the God of the entire Bible, is one single individual, one self, one he, one person, that is the Father. And the Father obviously is working through agents. So why would we even bother talking about messengers, malak, angelos in Greek? So my opponent cannot possibly show that the Old Testament actually teaches, not just hints at, not just clues, not just foreshadows, but actually shows and explains this doctrine he so boldly yet inconsistently professes. And the inconsistency comes in what I just showed you, that Moses and the kings and prophets speak as God in the first person. To put it in simple terms, folks, hints and clues do not a teaching make. And we all know that God, as the creator of language itself, is the most competent teacher there is. So if he teaches anything, it must by definition be clearly shown and explained. That's what teaching means. But as we just heard from my opponent himself, there is no Trinitarian to be found anywhere in the Old Testament. That should be the end of this debate. So first, summarize my points. I showed the many Trinitarian scholars, and Jonathan says, well, I simply disagree with them. Well, you're talking about Leonard Hodgson, the noted Anglican priest, philosopher, theologian, historian of the early church, Regius Professor of Divinity at Oxford. That doesn't make him right, but you have to respect those kinds of titles. And he said Christianity arose within Judaism, and the monotheism of Judaism was then, as it is still today, Unitarian. Murray Harris, Dr. Murray Harris, Jesus as God. These are evangelicals. These are Trinitarians. Listen to this. It was not the triune God of Christian theology who spoke to the forefathers in the prophets. Second, I showed that the Shema clearly shows one person. There's no three persons, no other person but the one Lord. One simply means one. It does not mean more than one. So I've shown that the biblical language cannot support the Trinitarian language that had to be created hundreds of years later, as my opponent had to concede. This is a later creation. So God is never a they, never a them, there, we, us, our. God never presents himself that way. Tens of thousands of singular personal pronouns cannot be ignored nor dissolved by some exceptions or some misreadings by my opponent. If the evidence were reversed, that is, if God was referring to himself as they, them, their, etc., thousands upon thousands of times, we would obviously all come to a very different conclusion today. Third, the Bible is a story about two lords. Psalm 110:1 is so important. Yahweh, also called Adonai, says to my Lord, Adoni. Never a title for deity, only humans and angels, as my opponent himself had to concede. Daniel 7:13 and 14. Again, it's the Son of Man is not deity. Humans are never worshipped as the one God of Israel, Yahweh. The biblical God is not an abstract idea, never an essence, never one what. And we look forward to that day, as Zechariah foresaw here in Zechariah 14, when we look forward eagerly with outstretched necks, as one scripture says, to the day when this truth will finally be understood for what it is, as God, as one divine person, that is the Father, Yahweh.